Hello, good morning. I am thrilled to be with you today. Though I am very sorry we cannot be together in person, I am so grateful we can still gather together through the wonders of modern technology. The theme of this conference is the story of you. Now, I come to you not as an expert in family history, but as a storyteller. I love stories, all stories. And in the time we have together today, I want to tell you some stories, talk about stories, and impress upon you how powerful these stories can be in shaping who we are and what we want to become. Because each of us is born descended from stories. We inherit them from our ancestors, the countries and cultures they come from, and we all carry the stories of our shared human past, of empires rising and falling, philosophies coming and going, and those myths and legends that stood the test of time. We inherit stories from our immediate families, the ones we collect as we sit around the dinner table, talk, and share our lives together. All of these stories bring us to today, to you. You are the hero of today's story, your story. You are the main character in your life, the protagonist of the present. You are the hero of your story. This is an important thing to realize, especially in doing family history work. I saw a meme on Facebook recently, and I had to print it off to share it with you. It's ancestral mathematics. It starts out by saying it took 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, and so on, 16 second great-grandparents, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,024 eighth great-grandparents, 2,048 ninth great-grandparents. For you to be born today from 12 previous generations, you needed a total of 4,094 ancestors over the last 400 years. Think for a moment. How many struggles, how many battles, how many difficulties, how much sadness, how much happiness, how many love stories, how many expressions of hope for the future did your ancestors have to undergo for you to exist in this present moment? I think that's a powerful perspective to realize. We do not exist in isolation. It took thousands of lives lived for you to exist today. And the whole picture of who you really are stretches back hundreds and hundreds of years. At a recent storytelling conference I attended, the renowned storyteller Donald Davis held up this picture. Do you recognize it? Of course you do. We know it as the Mona Lisa. It's one of, if not the most famous painting in the world. But something's missing. Though we have our central figure with her famous smile, the painting is incomplete. We are missing the background, the foreground, and everything else that makes the Mona Lisa the Mona Lisa. We have the short story, but what's the long story, the whole story? In your life, I would argue that you are the Mona Lisa, that central figure. And every story you find from your family history fills in that background and the foreground until bit by bit you start to see the complete picture of who you are. Now, to really illustrate this point, I'm going to tell you a story. It's a fairy tale. So stay with me, sit back, settle in as I tell you the story of the Ragbag Shoes. Once upon a time, in the kingdom of Bootsmake, there lived a poor shoemaker and his daughter Ayana. Ayana was about to turn 10 years old. Now, the 10th birthday was a very important birthday in the kingdom of Bootsmake, for when you turned 10, you received your first pair of magic shoes. Everyone in the kingdom of Bootsmake had a pair just for them. Some shoes could make you fly. Some could make you walk 7 leagues in a single step. Others allowed you to be an incredible dancer or give you wisdom beyond your years. The saying in Boots Make went like this: "The shoe will make the path I take. The path I choose will make my shoes." Now Ayana knew, since her father was the shoemaker, that her shoes would be the most beautiful, the most spectacular, and surely the most magical pair of shoes in the entire kingdom. She went to bed on the eve of her 10th birthday, dreaming of dancing at balls in her brand new, beautiful shoes. But the kingdom of Boots Make had fallen on hard times. First had come the famine, then the plague, then there were the fires, the storms and floods, the murder hornets. Let's just say it had been a hard year. And though magic shoes were very important, people couldn't really afford them. And the shoemaker was so kind and generous, he often gave away the shoes he made for practically nothing. And so it was. On the eve of his own daughter's 10th birthday, he had no materials left to make her shoes. The shoemaker sat at his empty workbench, staring out into the moonless night. How was he going to tell Ayana that there would be no magic shoes? When suddenly he heard a whistle coming from the corner of his shop. He looked over and he saw a pair of bright green shoelaces sticking out of a bag. It was his rag bag. It contained all the leftover bits and pieces from shoes that he had mended or found over the many years in his travels. And the shoemaker was struck with a flash of inspiration. He dumped the contents of the bag onto his workbench and picked through the scraps. A bit of leather, iron soles, satin, lace, golden threads, and the bright green shoelaces. Yes, there was still magic in all of them. He worked all night, carefully stitching and cobbling the pieces together until they were just right. In the morning, when Ayana awoke, he presented her with her very own pair of rag bag shoes. When Ayana saw the shoes her father had made her and learned that they had been made from rags, she burst into tears. "Those are the ugliest shoes I've ever seen!" And she threw them into the corner. "I will never wear them." The shoemaker realized he needed to go for a walk. And so Ayana was left alone in the workshop, feeling very sorry for herself. Then she heard a voice. "Don't you know who I am?" Ayana looked around, looking for who had spoken. "Don't you know where I came from?" Ayana looked down and saw that the shoes were walking towards her. They asked her again, "Don't you know how special I am?" I know you're ugly." "Pfft, ugly? Your father made me from very important shoes. Look here." Ayana looked inside the shoes. "Look inside. See that leather? That leather insole came from the very first pair of shoes ever made. And my sole comes from the iron boots that Floresita used to save the sleeping prince. This satin top comes from the youngest dancing princess. And this back here, why, it's the gold slipper Amatuga wore to the chief's son's dance." "Who? Who? You mean you've never heard these stories?" Ayana shook her head. "If you're going to walk in these shoes, you must know where they came from. You can't go anywhere if you don't know where you've been." And it was then that the rag bag shoes took Ayana on a journey into their past. First, they went to India, to a time before anyone wore shoes. In that long ago time, there was a king who hated taking baths so much that he never took one. It will not surprise you that he was a very smelly king. So smelly, people would faint when they got too close to him. But no one told him how badly he smelled because he was the king. One day, the king decided to pay a visit to a small village in his kingdom. And while he was there, a very honest young girl said, "You stink. You should take a bath." Humbled, the king did. He washed himself in the river, but when he stepped out onto the riverbank, his feet got dusty. No longer wanting to be a dirty, smelly king, he commanded the villagers to wash the riverbank. But this just turned the dust into mud, so he had to wash again. Upset that no matter how many times he washed, his feet kept getting dirty in the dust and the mud, the king commanded that they cover the entire earth in leather, so that wherever he walked, his feet would stay clean. He was now a good-smelling, very clean king, but his people were miserable. The plants would not grow if the ground was covered in leather. The animals could not eat, the people could not eat, and they began to starve. No one was happy but the king, and no one was honest enough to tell him why they were so unhappy because he was the king. So the king asked for the little village girl to come to the palace. She would tell him the truth. The little girl explained to the king how a ground covered in leather was killing the plants, starving the animals and the people. "But how can I keep my feet clean?" the king asked. The little girl asked for a pair of scissors and thread. She had the king stand on the leather, and she cut out a piece around his feet and sewed it together, making the very first pair of shoes. Now, wherever the king walked, his feet would stay dry and clean. And since everyone wanted a pair, the leather covering the earth was soon all used up. Ayana looked inside her shoes again. "That piece of leather comes from the king's shoes?" "Yes," the shoes explained, "and they still carry the magic of that little girl. Honesty." "What did you say about the iron soles? Where do they come from?" Come with me." Next, the shoes took Ayana to Spain, where Ayana learned the story of Florecita, a princess whose parents had kept her locked in her castle ever since her older brother Soñando had been stolen away by a jealous witch. One day, Florecita heard a bird singing the story of her lost brother, and the bird told her that he was cursed to sleep forever, guarded by white lions in the sleeping palace on the other side of the world. It was so far, a traveler must wear out a pair of iron boots to reach it. Florecita decided she must rescue her brother, and she crafted a pair of iron shoes that would take her across the world. She traveled in those shoes for months. The rain soaked her through, the sun burned her skin, and her feet formed blisters from the iron shoes. At last she came to the home of the East Wind, where his mother took pity on her, fed her, gave her salve for her feet, and hid her from her hot-tempered son who hated humans. This kind anciana slyly asked her son where to find the sleeping palace, and when he did not know, he suggested that his brother the West Wind may know. So Florecita traveled to the West Wind's home, and then to the South Wind, and finally to the North Wind's cottage, where she discovered she was finally, after a year's journey, at the sleeping palace. She tamed the white lions guarding the palace gates, and she threw off her iron shoes, because they were now worn through. She woke up her dear lost brother Soñando from his eternal sleep and took him home again. The ragbag shoes explained to Ayana, "The iron that was left from her brave journey now makes up the soles of your shoes." I see," said Ayana, "and their magic is courage. And the satin on top, where does that come from?" So the shoes took Ayana to Germany, where there lived 12 princesses. These princesses received a new pair of shoes each morning. But by the next day, these beautiful satin shoes were worn completely through. This so aggravated their father the king that he declared, should anyone find out the secret of his daughter's worn shoes, they would be rewarded with one of their hens in marriage. A young soldier, intelligent and kind, found out their secret. Because of his kindness, an old woman had gifted him with an invisible cloak and the knowledge not to drink the wine the princesses offered him at night. Slipping on the invisible cloak, he followed the princesses through a trapdoor in their room, through forests of gold, silver, and diamonds, across a lake as smooth as glass to a palace filled with music and light. There, the 12 princesses were greeted by 12 princes, and there they danced each night until their slippers were worn through. During all of this, the youngest princess, whose name was December, who was just as clever as the soldier, well, she soon discovered she was being watched. But she rather liked the soldier and admired his intelligence and kindness. So she gave him a little hope. And when the soldiers presented the secret of the 12 dancing princesses to the king, he and December were happily married, and they insisted on throwing dance parties nearly every night of their lives. The satin of Iana's shoes came from December's dancing slippers, and in it there was the magic of intelligence and wisdom. Last of all, Iana went with the ragbag shoes to Kenya, where she learned the story of Omotugwa, a kind servant girl who was treated cruelly by her mistress and her mistress's daughter. She was made to clean and cook until her skin went raw. She was not given a bed, but slept by the fire in the ashes. And the only food given her were the scraps her mistress's daughter refused to eat. Though often hungry, Omotugwa always shared what she was given with the beautiful blue and yellow sunbird who lived in the garden outside Omotugwa's hut. One day, when the chief's son invited all in the village to a dance, Omotugwa begged her mistress to go. She could go, her mistress declared, if she could pick out all the tiny stones from the millet grain. And then Omotugwa's mistress threw a handful of tiny stones into the bags of grain. Omotugwa knew the task was impossible, and she wept. But the sunbird, remembering Omotugwa's kindness, called on all the beautiful and magical birds of Kenya to come and help. Together, they picked all the stones from the grain, and then, when that was done, they began to dance and fly around Omotugwa. When they flew away, Omotugwa was now wearing a golden dress and golden slippers. She practically flew to the dance, where the chief's son was so struck by her beauty, he fell in love. But, fearing she might be recognized by her mistress, Omotugwa left the dance early, and in her haste she left behind one of her golden slippers. The chief's son took that slipper to every hut in the village till he found the girl he knew he was going to marry. At last, he found Omotugwa, and the golden slipper fit. When the chief's son and Omotugwa were married, the sunbird sang and sang until the fire of celebration was just an ember. After hearing this story, Iana gazed in wonder at her shoes. Omotugwa's golden slipper is now a part of my shoe? Yes, was the shoe's answer. And do you know what magic they contain, Iana? Kindness, Iana realized. When at last the ragbag shoes returned Iana home, she saw her father, the shoemaker, sitting alone at his empty workbench. When he looked up, she asked, "Papa, where do the shoelaces come from?" "From the elves, of course," her father replied. "They made me my first pair of magic shoes. When I was as poor as I am today, the little elves came in the night and helped me. They left their magic behind, and I've always been grateful for their kindness. And that gratitude was the final magic you wanted to give me. In that moment, Ayana felt all the love her father had given her by making those shoes. Seeing her tears, her father smiled and said, "Remember, Ayana, the shoe will make the path you take, but the path you choose will make your shoes." Ayana admired her ragbag shoes. Now that she knew their story, she thought they were the most beautiful shoes in the kingdom. She slipped them on, and they fit perfectly. The shoemaker held out his hand. Ayana took it, and together they danced. That is the story of the ragbag shoes. Thank you for allowing me to share that story with you. There are many lessons that I like to take from Ayana's story, but I told it to you today because I want to emphasize two of them. They both come from that saying in Boots Make: "The shoes will make the path you take. The path you choose will make your shoes." The first, the shoe will make the path you take. Can you know where you are going if you don't know where you've been? Ayana thought that her shoes were ugly until she knew their story. And so it is with our lives. The power that stories from our past can have on us is incalculable. These stories from our own history instill values, character, identity, and our sense of self. This is particularly powerful with family stories, and there's a lot of research showing how powerful it is. Dr. Marshall Duke, a psychologist from Emory University, and his colleague Robin Fisher set out to research myth and ritual in the American families in the late 1990s. And I quote now some of the research from a New York Times article that was titled "The Stories That Bind Us." It was published in March 2013. So Dr. Duke and Dr. Fisher developed a measure called the Do You Know scale that asked children to answer 20 questions. Some of these questions included, do you know where your grandparents grew up? Do you know where your mom and dad went to high school? Do you know where your parents met? Do you know an illness or something really terrible that happened in your family? Do you know the story of your birth? Dr. Duke and Dr. Fisher asked those questions of 4 dozen families in the summer of 2001 and taped several of their dinner table conversations. They then compared the children's results to a battery of psychological tests the children had taken and reached an overwhelming conclusion. The more children knew about their family's history, the stronger their sense of control over their lives, the higher their self-esteem, and the more successfully they believed their families functioned. The Do You Know scale turned out to be the best single predictor of children's emotional health and happiness. And then something unexpected happened. 2 months later was September 11th. And as citizens, Dr. Duke and Dr. Fisher were horrified like everyone else, but as psychologists, they knew they had been given a rare opportunity. Though the families they studied had not been directly affected by the events, all of the children had experienced the same national trauma at the same time. So the researchers went back and reassessed the children. Once again, Dr. Duke said, the ones who knew more about their families proved to be more resilient, meaning they could moderate the effects of stress. Another study reported on by The Atlantic showed that adolescents with a stronger knowledge of family history have more robust identities, better coping skills, and lower rates of depression and anxiety. Family storytelling can help a child grow into a teen who feels connected to the important people in her life. Every piece we find from where we've been fills in the background of our lives, giving us a greater sense of who we are and who we want to become. I think of my own ragbag life and the stories that have influenced my perception of self. One of the pieces of my ragbag is music. I come from a very musical family. I grew up surrounded by musical noise. Altogether, my 5 siblings and I played piano, violin, guitar, trumpet, drums, ukulele, and we all sang in choirs. My parents loved to sing in the church choirs, and my father wrote songs, so we all write songs. But where did that music come from? You go back, and there are stories. My father's father, my grandfather, sang low bass in a barbershop quartet for decades, and we treasure the recordings his quartet made together. One of my favorite stories about my Grandpa Guy is about his love for music and his desire to share it. So once a month, there would be a testimony meeting in his church congregation, and anyone was allowed to go up to the pulpit and share a declaration of faith. Well, my grandpa took this as an opportunity to sing. And instead of walking up to speak, he would have an accompanist prepared to go up to the piano. He would walk up, and then he would sing out his testimony. But the music came from my mother's side too. I have fond memories of my grandmother standing beside the piano singing Girl from Ipanema. And some of my favorite stories of my grandpa, Arvidsson, were about his time playing the trombone in the Marine Corps band during World War II. He told me how one day they were going to record on the radio and they needed a violinist. Now, Grandpa had played a bit when he was really young, so when someone barked at him, "Arvidsson, you play the violin?" He replied, "Yes, sir." And then he picked up the violin, which he hadn't touched in years, and he played live on the radio right then and there. The magic I get from these stories isn't just that my grandparents loved music, but that they were fearless in sharing their love for it. They played and they sang not because they were the best, but because they could and they loved to. And I can't tell you how many times I've wanted to stop singing or play my guitar, stop playing my violin or guitar because I wasn't the best or I wasn't that good. And then I remember that in my family, you just play, you just sing because you love the music. Another ragbag was that I grew up believing I could do hard things, that bravery grew in my blood and bones, that I could be a pioneer in whatever I believed in because of the stories of my ancestors who left their beloved home in Sweden to find work in the Northwest in the paper mills, or the stories of my other ancestors who believed in something so strongly they joined the Mormon pioneers and crossed the plains west to build a new life. Or there's the story of my own mother, who was the first in her family to leave the town she grew up in and go to college. Not because anyone encouraged her, but because she knew it was the right thing to do, even when it was terrifying. When I am full of self-doubt and fear and cowardice, I remember that in my family, we have faith to cross oceans, great plains, and family expectations. If they could be so brave, so can I. As I explore these stories of where I came from, the picture of me starts to fill out even more. I look at the ragbag of my strengths and my weaknesses, and I start to see the whole thing as beautiful. Because they are me, and I am them. This knowledge has not only changed the way I see my character, but it's transformed even the way I see my own face. In a society that cares so much about appearance, it's very common to look in the mirror and look for flaws. We plaster ourselves with makeup, or we consider plastic surgery to reach that perfect idea of a beautiful face or body. But that all changed for me when I began to look at the pictures of my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and my other ancestors. When I looked at that picture of my grandmother and saw her eyes, I realized they were my eyes. And when she passed away, looking in the mirror every day became a precious reunion with her. Now, when I look at myself in the mirror, I see the smile I share with my mother and a half a dozen cousins, my teeth and gums remind me of my father's and my aunts and my uncles. The shape of my face and the curls in my hair are the same as my sister's. My nose is in a black and white photograph, decades old. When I look in the mirror now, I see a family reunion, and it's beautiful. In my face are their lives lived, are their stories, and their stories are the gift that I've inherited. So what are the stories in your rag bag? What do you pull from your past, from your ancestors or heritage that have deeply influenced who you are today? And where do you want to fill in that background a little more? Now, one of the realities of diving into our family or personal past is that it can sometimes be painful, can't it? With 4,094 ancestors in the past 12 generations, not all of their stories have happy endings, or even endings at all. As we uncover stories and see pictures unfold in our own backgrounds, they may be things we don't want to see, or mysteries we may never have answers to. For example, my great-grandmother's father is a dead end in our family tree. We don't know where he came from, and no matter how hard we search, there is just a huge question mark before him, and we may never find the answer. In researching my own family history, I have learned that I am the descendant of deserters, pioneers, kings, polygamists, musicians, mill workers, soldiers, farmers. I'm a descendant of many different people who struggled with the hard things of life. Alcoholism runs in my family. Depression and other mental illnesses do too. And there are secrets I will never know because they are kept hidden or swept under the rug or tucked neatly away until they were forgotten. This is why that second lesson from the rag bag shoes is just as important as the first. Yes, the shoes you've inherited will make the path you take, but the path you choose will make your shoes. Even though Ayana's shoes carry the pieces of many stories, they are her shoes. They are no longer the kings or the princesses or Florecitas or Omotuguas. They are now Ayana's. Ayana gets to decide what she will do with those shoes and their magic. She can dance or walk or skip in them however she chooses. It's now her story. The path she chooses will make her shoes and form the magic that she imbues in them. When my husband and I were married, we sat down and we looked at our families with a loving and critical eye, and then discussed what we wanted our little family story to be. What values and traditions would we treasure? What family curses would end with us? And what new beginnings would start with us? We tried to do this without judgment or victimhood, but rather acknowledgement, forgiveness, and an optimism that we were the heroes of this next chapter. Because as the hero of your story, today's story, you get to decide what you will do with the shoes, with the face, or with the life you were given. The story of you today is as important to your family history as the stories from your past. I quote now from Donald Davis's Telling Your Own Stories. It's a wonderful little book. And in it he said, "Many of us remember family stories as being told by older family members who, in their later life, recounted their own formative adventures time after time until they became either outlandish or boring. On the other hand, most of us wish that we had somehow preserved more of those stories that we know we heard but cannot quite recall now. We tend to forget that we might have our own stories to tell as well. We wish that we had preserved the stories of Grandma, but miss the fact that for our own children and grandchildren, and even for our own generation, we are the ones who must be storytellers if there is to be a richness of family stories in years to come." The present moment is the great intersection between the way things were and the way we want things to be. So, what are you doing with your part of the story? What you choose to do with your chapter might just determine what magic you give to others, because you have the power to shape the narrative of yourself and your family. You see, it is not just what stories we tell, how we tell them that makes all the difference. Psychologists have found that every family has a unifying narrative. And in his research, Dr. Duke explained that those narratives take one of three shapes. And I quote again from that article. First, there is the ascending family narrative, such as, son, when we came to this country, we had nothing. Our family worked, we opened a store, your grandfather went to high school, your father went to college, and now you. Second is the descending narrative. Sweetheart, we used to have it all, and then we lost everything. The most healthful narrative, Dr. Duke continued, is the third one. It's called the oscillating family narrative. Dear, let me tell you, we've had ups and downs in our family. We built a family business. Your grandfather was a pillar of the community. Your mother was on the board of the hospital. But we also had setbacks. You had an uncle who was once arrested. We had a house burned down. Your father lost a job. But no matter what happened, we always stuck together as a family. Dr. Duke said that children who have the most self-confidence have what he and Dr. Fisher call a strong intergenerational self. They know they belong to something bigger than themselves. And by telling your story in an oscillating way with the whole truth of the ups and downs you face in life, you are filling in that background for someone else. I quote again, decades of research have shown that most happy families communicate effectively, but talking doesn't mean simply talking through problems, as important as that is. Talking also means telling a positive story about yourselves. When faced with a challenge, happy families, like happy people, just add a new chapter to their life story that shows them overcoming the hardship. This skill is particularly important for children whose identity tends to get locked in during adolescence. The bottom line, if you want a happier family, create, refine, and retell the story of your family's positive moments and your ability to bounce back from the difficult ones. That act alone may increase the odds that your family will thrive for many generations to come. Now, what if you were thinking, but I have no stories to tell? I promise you that you do. And let's start finding them today. I'm going to share with you some story prompts to give you ideas of where to begin. Then, you can choose to tell these stories around the dinner table, at Thanksgiving, driving in the car, or in those quiet moments with your friends and family. Write them down in your journal. Record yourself with a voice recording app or in a video. Ask these questions of your family and friends and collect their stories. Make reminiscing and storytelling a habit. I take these story prompts from two places. The first is from a workshop by Jennifer Monroe, and I have made a handout for you that you can download later if you would like. Here are some prompts to tickle your brain about characters in your life, such as, who was your favorite relative or one you disliked? Who was your favorite teacher? Who was the teacher who frightened you? Who was the bully in your life? Who was an unsung hero? Who was someone you saved? Who was someone you should have helped? And there are now situational prompts, places you've been or different times. When was a time you learned the rules of fair play? What was a trick you or someone you know played? A time when you cheated. A time you learned to be a good sport. The time you realized your parents were actual human beings. A time you learned not to take yourself so seriously. And here are prompts about place. What was the favorite place you visited as a child? A place where you found something important. A place where you lost something of great value. A place where you got lost. I have more story prompts from Donald Davis's book, Telling Your Own Stories, for family and classroom storytelling, public speaking, and personal journaling, and I highly recommend this book. Can you remember a pet you once had, but you don't have anymore? Can you remember a time when you got locked out of where you needed to be? Can you remember a time when you almost won, but not quite? Can you remember a time you were tricked or lied to? Take us with you when you had to move from one home to another. Take us with you back home for a childhood holiday meal. And take us to a place you went only once, but have always wanted to go back to again. Can you introduce us to the oldest person you can remember knowing when you were a child? And can you tell us about an early friend whom you wonder what finally happened to them? Can you help us meet someone who used to come and visit at your house when you were growing up? Can you introduce us to someone at your class reunion? I've compiled this list of stories which I will share with you. I encourage you to take some of these prompts that I've spoken to you today or to look at the handout and reminisce. Write it down. Tell it to someone else. There is an African proverb that says, when an old person dies, it is as if a library goes up in flames. No matter how young or old you may be, you are this generation's and the next generation's library. So find your stories from the past. Take every scrap you have. Learn your stories. Write your own life stories and tell your stories over and over and over again to your family, to your communities, to each other. Fill in that background, surrounding who you are. Continuously cobble together your own pair of shoes. You are the hero. So dance. Write the next chapter, your chapter. Please own and treasure the whole story of you.